He was crowned as the most powerful man in the world, yet within just 4 years, he turned his palace into a playground of shocking orgies, defied every tradition of Rome, and dared to call himself a goddess instead of an emperor. But what happened when his pleasures clashed with the power of the Roman army? This is the unbelievable story of the emperor who pushed Rome to the edge of madness and paid the ultimate price. Stay with us till the end to uncover secrets history tried to erase. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of the past. In the grand theaters of history, few emperors have captured the world's imagination with as much scandal, excess, and debauchery as the Roman Emperor. His reign was brief, chaotic, and notorious, remembered less for achievements of state and more for the shocking ways he turned the palace itself into a playground of indulgence. Elagabalus was only a teenager when he rose to power, yet his name has lived on for centuries because of the unrestrained pleasures, forbidden practices, and shocking spectacles that became daily life under his rule. To many Romans, his court resembled less the center of an empire and more the heart of an endless, extravagant orgy. The story of how one emperor blurred the line between royal duty and unquenchable desire is both fascinating and disturbing, and it is here that our journey begins. Born as Varius Avitus Spacianus in 204 AD, the boy who would become Emperor Elagabalus seemed destined for an unusual path from the beginning. His family wielded influence through his grandmother Julia Maesa, who held deep connections to the imperial household. After the violent death of Emperor Caracalla and the downfall of the short-lived rule of Macrinus, the empire was ripe for manipulation. Julia Maesa saw her opportunity and rallied legions in Syria to declare her grandson emperor. In 218 AD, the 14-year-old boy suddenly found himself on the throne of Rome, a child king in a world of seasoned generals, cunning senators, and treacherous courtiers. Elagabalus would soon learn that absolute power gave him freedom that he would wield in the most shocking ways. Elagabalus' youth and inexperience were obvious, but what shocked Rome even more were his priorities. Rather than focusing on war, governance, or diplomacy, he poured his attention into personal pleasure, shocking rituals, and the pursuit of desires that scandalized even the most jaded Romans. To him, the palace was not a seat of statecraft but a theater, a stage upon which he could indulge in every fantasy and whim. The court quickly became notorious for its lavish banquets, exotic entertainments, and, most infamously, endless nights of indulgence that blurred the lines between celebration and sin. Accounts of these days come to us from historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, though their writings are laced with moral judgment and perhaps exaggeration. Still, even when taken with caution, the sheer volume of accusations paints a portrait of an emperor who delighted in breaking taboos. He invited countless men and women into his palace, not as dignitaries, but as partners in wild celebrations. Orgies, it was said, became nightly events in the imperial residence. The marble halls, once reserved for senatorial debates or imperial decrees, echoed instead with laughter, music, and the sounds of debauchery. But Elagabalus' indulgences went beyond mere physical pleasure. He reveled in shock value, in doing what others dared not even whisper. He was known to marry multiple times, even taking a Vestal virgin as his bride, a sacred priestess sworn to chastity. Such an act was unthinkable, a direct violation of Rome's most sacred traditions. To the emperor, however, the scandal was not a concern, but a thrill. He believed that his divine status gave him the right to defy human law. This attitude fueled the atmosphere of excess that consumed the palace. Feasts under Elagabalus were legendary. Guests would recline on couches covered in silk while being served exotic dishes from across the empire, ostrich tongues, peacock brains, and dishes drenched in rare spices. Rivers of wine flowed from golden vessels, while dancers, musicians, and performers entertained between courses. Yet beneath the glittering luxury was a darker truth. These banquets often transformed into wild orgies, where noblemen and women, servants and strangers, mingled without distinction. The emperor himself delighted in these spectacles, often participating openly, choosing partners at will, and rewarding those who pleased him with gold, jewels, or political favor. One of the most infamous tales of Elagabalus' excess was his obsession with roleplay and disguise. He often dressed not as a ruler but as a servant, waiting on his guests, only to switch roles moments later and demand worship as a god. He blurred gender roles, wore women's clothing, and demanded to be addressed as both emperor and empress. To the Roman elite, this was more than scandalous, it was dangerous, a challenge to the very social order upon which their world rested. Yet for Elagabalus it was exhilarating. Every broken rule, every shattered expectation, seemed to fuel his hunger for more. His fascination with religion only added fuel to the fire. As the high priest of the sun god Elagabal, from whom he took his imperial name, he attempted to elevate his Syrian deity above Jupiter, the chief god of Rome. In lavish ceremonies, he brought his god's sacred stone to Rome and demanded worship across the empire. To him, the palace was not just a seat of power but a temple, and his revelries often blurred the line between sacred ritual and orgiastic spectacle. What to Romans seemed blasphemy, To Elagabalus was divine expression. Those closest to him often found themselves unwilling participants in his games. Senators, generals, and courtiers were invited to feasts they could not refuse, drawn into spectacles that compromised their dignity and reputation. Many feared that to resist the emperor's whims meant exile or execution. Thus, the palace became a gilded prison for the elite, a place where the emperor's every desire was law. The line between power and pleasure vanished, leaving only the emperor's will. Yet even as he indulged, shadows gathered. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's powerful protectors of the emperor, grew uneasy. Senators whispered in secret about the dangers of a ruler more concerned with his own pleasure than the empire's survival. The people of Rome, entertained at first, grew restless as taxes rose and the empire's stability weakened. But in these early days of his reign, Elagabalus was oblivious to the growing storm. He believed himself untouchable, divine, and destined to live forever in pleasure. The orgies of Elagabalus' palace were not merely nights of indulgence, they became symbols of a reign consumed by excess. His name would forever be linked to scandal, his palace remembered not as a center of empire but as the site of unending revelry. What began as the curiosity of a teenage ruler had grown into a tidal wave of desire, drowning out the responsibilities of an emperor. For Rome, the question was not whether Elagabalus could rule, but how long such madness could last before it consumed both him and the empire itself. This was only the beginning of a reign that defied every expectation, where pleasure became politics and the palace itself became an orgy. The descent had only just begun, and history would record it not as a golden age but as one of the empire's darkest spectacles. If the first years of Elagabalus' reign shocked Rome with lavish feasts and reckless indulgence, what followed plunged the empire even deeper into scandal. His palace, already whispered about as a den of pleasures, soon became infamous as a stage for spectacles so outrageous that they seemed to mock the very foundation of Roman society. With each passing month, the boy emperor grew bolder, testing the patience of senators, generals, priests, and the people, as though daring them to challenge his divine authority. The teenage ruler seemed intoxicated by more than just wine and luxury. He was intoxicated by the power of shock itself. Every time he broke a taboo, every time he flaunted a forbidden act, he appeared to grow hungrier for another transgression. The palace ceased to be a court of state, it became a theater of provocation, and all of Rome was forced to watch. Elagabalus' relationship with the sacred institutions of Rome became a source of endless tension. As high priest of the Syrian sun god, Elagabal, he sought to replace Jupiter, the father of Roman gods, with his foreign deity. He ordered grand ceremonies where he himself presided not as emperor but as priest, dressed in silken robes adorned with jewels, parading through the streets of Rome in a golden chariot drawn by horses. At his side, senators and generals were forced to walk as attendants, humiliated before the people. For Elagabalus, it was not enough to be worshipped. As emperor, he demanded recognition as the living embodiment of his god. The ceremonies, however, were only the public face of his obsession. Within the palace walls, rituals were merged with indulgence in ways that horrified Roman tradition. Sacred rites dissolved into wild celebrations, with music, dancing, and acts of pleasure carried out in the very halls where once the empire's most serious decisions had been made. Guests were told they were not feasting with the emperor but worshipping with a god. The line between sacred and profane blurred until it no longer existed. One of the most infamous aspects of Elagabalus' reign was his disregard for traditional gender roles. Roman society, though not entirely rigid, still expected emperors to embody a certain image of masculinity, strong, disciplined, and commanding. Elagabalus shattered that image with delight. He dressed in women's clothing, painted his face with cosmetics, and wore elaborate wigs. At feasts, he sometimes appeared as a bride, other times as a dancer, twirling through the hall. As guests watched in stunned silence, it was whispered that he even asked physicians to perform impossible surgeries to transform his body into that of a woman, offering vast sums of gold for such an operation. To many Romans, this was madness. To Elagabalus, it was liberation. He did not see himself bound by mortal categories of male or female, emperor or empress. He was whatever he desired to be in that moment, and he forced Rome to acknowledge it. But these personal explorations did not remain private. They spilled into the public life of the empire. The emperor married multiple times, divorcing and remarrying with little regard for tradition. Among his most scandalous unions was his marriage to a Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa. The Vestals were sacred priestesses, sworn to 30 years of chastity in service to the goddess Vesta. To marry one was not only forbidden, it was seen as a direct affront to the gods themselves. Yet Elagabalus declared that their union was divine, meant to create children of sacred blood. To Romans, this was blasphemy beyond comprehension. His marriages, however, were only a fraction of his affairs. The emperor's appetite for partners seemed endless. He took lovers from every walk of life, nobles, gladiators, servants, and strangers plucked from the streets. He offered gold, titles, and even political offices to those who pleased him. His favorites were showered with wealth, while those who bored him were cast aside without mercy. The palace became a revolving door of partners, and with each new affair, whispers spread further through the city. Feasts grew more extravagant, and their stories more outrageous. Cassius Dio, though perhaps prone to exaggeration, describes banquets where guests were buried under showers of rose petals, smothered to death in the emperor's pursuit of spectacle. In another tale, Elagabalus allegedly released wild animals into the dining hall, forcing guests to scramble in terror while he laughed at the chaos. Whether entirely true or embellished, such accounts reveal how his reign was remembered not as governance but as performance, as a series of shocking scenes meant to display the emperor's power to do whatever he pleased. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a darker reality. The empire itself was straining. Beyond the palace walls, legions guarded distant borders against threats from Parthians, Germans, and others who saw Rome's weakness. The treasury groaned under the weight of endless spending on feasts, jewels, and luxuries. Senators found themselves sidelined, their advice ignored, their dignity stripped away in humiliating ceremonies. Too many, Rome no longer felt like an empire, it felt like the stage of one boy's never-ending orgy. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal protectors of emperors, began to murmur among themselves. They saw how the people's faith in their ruler was eroding, how senators whispered in dark corners about rebellion. They, too, grew weary of being forced to participate in humiliating rituals, paraded as servants in their own city. Elagabalus' grandmother, Julia Misa, who had orchestrated his rise to power, also began to sense danger. She saw that her grandson's behavior, unchecked, might soon doom not only him but her family's entire hold on power. But if Elagabalus noticed the shifting winds, he did not care. In his mind, he was invincible, shielded by divine favor and surrounded by riches. Each new scandal seemed to embolden him further. He mocked senators openly, dismissed Roman traditions as old and dull, and surrounded himself with foreign priests, dancers, and lovers who reinforced his sense of superiority. The more resistance he felt, the more outrageous his actions became, as though daring his enemies to act against him. His obsession with transformation grew darker. He ordered his body to be pierced and adorned with jewels. He demanded to be addressed not just as emperor but as lady. At feasts, he sometimes demanded that his guests play roles in his fantasies, acting out scenes of marriage, servitude, or worship. The palace ceased to function as a center of power and instead resembled a living play, scripted by the emperor's desires. Those who resisted risked exile, confiscation of wealth, or even execution. The people of Rome, once entertained by tales of palace indulgence, began to turn against their ruler. Bread and circuses could distract them only so much when taxes rose and the dignity of their empire seemed daily degraded. Markets buzzed with rumors of the emperor's nightly games, of his shameful disguises, of his cruelty disguised as entertainment. For the proud citizens of Rome, it was a humiliation to be ruled by a boy who treated the empire like a stage for his pleasures. By the midpoint of his reign, Elagabalus had transformed the palace into the very symbol of excess. His court was described not in terms of laws passed or battles won, but in terms of feasts, lovers, and scandals. Every corner of the empire whispered about him, from soldiers on the frontier to traders in distant markets. His name became a curse, synonymous with decadence and disgrace. And yet, despite the growing resentment, he remained unafraid. He believed himself chosen by the gods, untouchable, destined to live as both emperor and goddess. He surrounded himself with luxury, smothered in perfumes, silks, and jewels, even as his empire strained beneath the weight of his whims. The palace had become an endless orgy, but outside its gilded walls, storm clouds gathered. Rome could not endure forever under such chaos. The seeds of betrayal had already been sown, and soon they would bear deadly fruit. The empire that had once feared the iron fist of emperors like Augustus, Trajan, or Marcus Aurelius was now ruled by a boy who treated the throne as a stage for scandal. By the third year of Elagabalus' reign, the patience of Rome was wearing thin. His endless feasts, his blasphemous rituals, his reckless marriages, and his disregard for Roman tradition had turned admiration into disgust, and disgust into anger. Behind the laughter and whispers, rebellion began to stir, but Elagabalus was oblivious. He still believed himself untouchable. In his mind, the gods themselves had placed him on the throne, and no mortal could bring him down. His palace continued to operate as a carnival of pleasures. Nightly feasts drowned in wine, lovers rotated like actors in a play, and sacred ceremonies blended into games of indulgence. Yet outside the marble walls, senators, soldiers, and even his own family plotted. Julia Misa, his grandmother and the woman who had brought him to power, had grown increasingly alarmed. She had supported him to secure her family's grip on the throne after the fall of the Severan dynasty. But what she saw now terrified her. Her grandson was reckless, ungovernable, and rapidly losing the loyalty of Rome's most important power, the Praetorian Guard. These soldiers, who held the fate of emperors in their hands, had grown resentful of Elagabalus' humiliations and suspicious of his foreign priests and lovers who filled the palace. Misa understood the danger. If Elagabalus continued unchecked, not only would he fall, but her entire family could be wiped out in the backlash. She began quietly shifting her attention toward her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, a boy of calmer temperament and more Roman manners. Alexander was popular with the people and respected by the guard. To Misa, he represented survival. To Elagabalus, however, Alexander was a threat. Rumors began to spread that the guard preferred Alexander as emperor. When these whispers reached Elagabalus, his paranoia ignited. He saw betrayal everywhere. His feasts grew darker, tinged with cruelty. He lashed out at senators with insults and mockery, executed officials on the thinnest suspicions, and tried to assert his dominance over the guard with displays of extravagance. Instead of calming tensions, he only deepened the divide. The emperor's obsession with shocking Rome continued to spiral. He flaunted his relationships more openly, parading his lovers in public and granting them honors meant for generals and statesmen. One lover, a charioteer named Heracles, was treated as a husband. Elagabalus called himself his wife, and the entire court was expected to acknowledge the relationship. To traditional Romans, this was an abomination, but Elagabalus seemed to revel in their outrage. At the same time, his fascination with ritual and transformation reached new extremes. He dedicated vast sums of gold to his foreign god, building temples and demanding that the most sacred Roman relics like the Palladium and the sacred fire of Vesta be transferred to his Syrian deity's shrine. He declared that his god was greater than Jupiter, greater than Mars, greater than any Roman god who had ever been worshipped. To the devout, this was heresy. To the proud, it was an insult to Rome itself. And yet, within the palace, the emperor still lived in a world of silks, perfumes, and games. He spent hours being adorned by slaves, painted, dressed, and perfumed. He demanded to be addressed with feminine titles, often calling himself empress rather than emperor. He ordered doctors to create procedures that could transform him into a woman entirely, offering rewards for anyone who could achieve what was then impossible. To the outside world, these stories leaked as proof of his madness, but the truth was darker than eccentricity. Elagabalus was not just indulging in fantasies, he was losing touch with reality itself. The empire was collapsing under the strain of his reign, but he remained blinded by his own desires. The people of Rome, once entertained by scandal, now cried out for change. Grain shortages, rising taxes, and military unrest only sharpened their anger. The Praetorian Guard, who had tolerated much in exchange for gold and privilege, began to doubt whether this emperor could protect the empire at all. Tensions came to a breaking point in the year 222. Julia Misa and her daughter Julia Mamaea, mother of young Alexander, quietly plotted with the Guard. They promised stability, dignity, and the restoration of Roman tradition if Alexander were raised to power. Secret meetings were held, alliances forged, and soon, the Guard was divided, half still loyal to half ready to crown Alexander. When Elagabalus learned of the plot, his paranoia erupted into desperation. He ordered that Alexander be stripped of his titles and removed from his position as Caesar. But the Guard resisted. They adored the young boy, whose modesty and Roman character stood in stark contrast to Elagabalus' extravagance. Fearing the loss of his throne, Elagabalus began to plan Alexander's execution. He summoned his cousin to the palace, perhaps intending to dispose of him quietly. But the Guard, enraged by the threat, refused to allow it. The palace, once a stage for feasts, became a battlefield of wills. Guards, loyal to Elagabalus, clashed with those sworn to Alexander. Shouts rang through the halls, and tension mounted as the emperor demanded obedience. But the tide had already turned. Julia Misa and Julia Mamaea had secured enough loyalty to protect Alexander. The boy was shielded, while Elagabalus found himself increasingly isolated. On the streets of Rome, rumors swirled that the emperor was about to be overthrown. Citizens whispered of plots, of betrayals, of the Guard's growing defiance. And yet, Elagabalus still held feasts, still bathed in perfumes, still pretended he was untouchable. But beneath the silks, fear gnawed at him. He began disguising himself at night, sneaking through the city in women's clothing, visiting taverns and brothels where he thought no one would recognize him. Yet even there, whispers followed him. The emperor was a shadow of power, mocked even by the people he once terrified. The final act was already approaching. The Guard, once the shield of emperors, had turned into the executioners of decadence. Julia Misa's plot was in motion, and the palace walls that had sheltered Elagabalus' endless orgy were about to become his tomb. By the early months of 222, Rome held its breath. The empire was ready for change. The boy emperor who had treated the throne as a stage 4 scandal was about to face the ultimate betrayal from the very soldiers who once carried him to power. The story of Elagabalus was moving toward its bloody climax, and in the shadows of the palace, death was waiting. By the year 222, the palace of Rome no longer echoed with laughter and music, but with whispers of betrayal. The emperor, once untouchable, had become a prisoner of his own paranoia. Elagabalus still wrapped himself in silks, still perfumed his skin, still played the role of a goddess empress, but behind the masks, He trembled. For the first time since his coronation, he realized that power was slipping through his jeweled fingers. The source of his terror was not an enemy general or a foreign invader. It was his own blood. His cousin, Severus Alexander, had grown into the darling of Rome. While Elagabalus scandalized the empire with his feasts and marriages, Alexander charmed the people with humility, modesty, and respect for tradition. The Praetorian Guard adored him, the senators tolerated him, and the common people whispered prayers for him. In contrast, Elagabalus was mocked, feared, and despised. Julia Misa, the iron-willed grandmother who had once engineered Elagabalus' rise, now quietly moved her pieces to secure Alexander's future. She knew Rome could not endure her elder grandson's chaos any longer. Survival meant sacrifice. Elagabalus, sensing the shifting winds, acted in desperation. He stripped Alexander of his titles, humiliated him in public, and threatened to banish him. But the guard refused to obey. The soldiers, who had once shouted "Hail Emperor!" in triumph, now openly defied him. The boy who called himself the Bride of Heracles had become a joke in the barracks. When he spoke, fewer and fewer listened. Enraged, Elagabalus planned the ultimate act, Alexander's execution. If his cousin were dead, no one could replace him. He summoned Alexander to the palace under false pretenses. But Julia Mamaea, Alexander's mother, alerted the guard. The soldiers intervened, shielding the boy and openly declaring their loyalty to him. For the first time, Elagabalus realized the truth. He was emperor in name only. The palace became a pressure cooker of fear and rebellion. Servants whispered of assassination, courtiers fled in silence, and Julia Misa plotted her grandson's removal with cold precision. Yet Elagabalus refused to surrender. He still held feasts, still dressed in dazzling gowns, still paraded Heracles as his husband. But outside the palace walls, Rome seethed. The markets buzzed with rumors. Citizens spat at his name. Senators plotted in shadows, and the guards sharpened their blades. The breaking point came in March 222. Elagabalus ordered the guard to kill Alexander. The soldiers refused. Instead, they stormed the palace. The emperor, frantic, tried to flee. Some sources say he attempted to hide in a chest. Others claim he disguised himself in women's clothes and begged for mercy. But when the guard broke through, there was no escape. They dragged him from his chambers, along with his mother, Julia Soaemias, who screamed and clung to him. The emperor, who had once ruled Rome with arrogance and scandal, was now a terrified boy clinging to his mother's robes. But the guards showed no mercy. They cut him down, ignoring his cries, and slaughtered his mother beside him. The scene was gruesome. The emperor's body was mutilated, stripped, and dragged through the streets. The people who had once cheered his coronation now spat at his corpse. The mob mocked him, jeered at him, and celebrated his fall. The boy who had called himself a goddess, who had turned the palace into an orgy, who had mocked the traditions of Rome, was reduced to nothing more than a bloodied carcass dragged through the filth of the city. Finally, the guard threw his body into the Tiber River, as if to erase his memory entirely. No funeral, no honors, no dignity. The emperor of Rome had died like a criminal, his reign ending in humiliation. And yet, even in death, Elagabalus refused to disappear from history. The stories of his reign lived on, whispered by senators, retold by historians, exaggerated by God. Some painted him as a monster, others as a victim of Rome's intolerance, still others as a tragic figure lost in his own desires. But one truth remained clear. His short rule had shaken the empire to its core. Rome quickly embraced Alexander as the new emperor. Under his calm guidance, the city seemed to breathe again. The temples were restored, the guard reassured, the Senate pacified. Rome pretended that the nightmare had ended, yet the memory of Elagabalus lingered like a stain. His extravagance, his shocking defiance of tradition, and his obsession with pleasure became the stuff of legend. For centuries, his name was synonymous with scandal. Historians mocked him, moralists used him as a warning, and gossip painted him in colors darker than perhaps reality deserved. Was he truly mad, or merely misunderstood? Was he a villain, or a boy destroyed by the weight of a crown he never wanted? The truth may be more complicated than the stories that survived. What we know for certain is this: Elagabalus remains one of the most infamous emperors in Roman history. His reign, brief as it was, embodied both the height of indulgence and the depths of downfall. His palace of orgies, his defiance of gender norms, his reckless extravagance, all these made him unforgettable. And his death, bloody and humiliating, became a grim reminder of the price of excess. The empire moved on, but the memory of the boy emperor lingered. For Rome, his reign was a warning. For historians, his story became a fascination. And for us, his life and death remain one of history's most haunting tales, a reminder that power without restraint and desire without limits can consume even the mightiest throne.